Let's get started with what has happened in the summit in Switzerland. Before the summit, we had Putin putting out preconditions for any sort of peace talks and negotiations that may happen in the future. But how did you find the timing of these strategy on the part of, I don't know if we can call it a strategy, but he was trying to influence the summit in Switzerland. He was putting out these preconditions just to show what Russia thinks at this particular moment.
Right. So it was an attempt to preempt the Swiss conference, Swiss summit, I guess, so conference, and to replace the agenda of the Ukrainian agenda and the Western agenda of a unified front with a discussion of the need for Russia to be at the table, for there to be a movement toward peace. And I must say, overall, I think that strategy worked, because at the end of the Swiss conference, most people, it seems in the press, came to the conclusion that nothing was really accomplished. There were obvious differences at the conference, even among the people who were invited to the conference to demonstrate unity. The whole purpose of coming to the conference was to show solidarity with Ukraine. And yet about 15 countries didn't even sign the final communique, and that's about 15%. And as a result, even the communique itself was very watered down, and ended the communique with a very important point, which was that the statement that peace requires the involvement of and dialogue between all parties. Obviously, that means Russia. So I guess Ukraine is now on record as agreeing with the consensus in the world, or certainly the West, on the need to involve all parties and have a dialogue with all parties.
Yeah, when it comes to the preconditions, particularly, Putin was talking about Ukrainian army just taking out their troops from Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, and
Right.
just giving up on their aspirations to join NATO. These two were so bold in these preconditions, and he said something that was, I think, that was so amazing, that he wanted to build on those negotiations in Istanbul. That was a very positive point coming out of these preconditions. And the other point that it was so tricky in this precondition was that he said that these conditions are so fluid. As time goes by, they're not gonna stay the same. And how do you evaluate these preconditions?
So I think from Russia's perspective, the objective was to reiterate both the reasons that Russia invaded Ukraine. And by the way, it's important to remember that in the context of making and reiterating the basic Russian proposal for negotiations, Putin, in a very long speech to the staff at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, explained the rationale for everything that happened. So again, he keeps coming back and reminding the world about Russia's fundamental issues with Western intervention in Ukraine and why the expansion of NATO is seen by Russia as an existential threat, a security threat, and why, therefore, Russia needed to intervene because the West was ignoring its concerns. So in the context of doing that, what I think Russia has done successfully is to present an alternative to the 10-point Zelensky peace proposal. Simply by, in this last statement that Putin made, narrowing, or let's say reducing, the number from 10 points to just 1, which is obviously easier to remember. And the 1 point that he insisted on was issuing an official statement that Ukraine does not intend to join NATO. Now, that could be worded as a statement of neutrality, as that's the way it was formulated in the Istanbul Accords, which you mentioned. Beyond that, so that's the only requirement for starting negotiations. The secondary aspect is to withdraw troops from the territories that are currently partly under Russian control to enable a ceasefire. So I would distinguish between two objectives that I would say Russia is offering as immediate possibilities. One is a ceasefire, ending the bloodshed, simply by withdrawing the troops back from these territories that Ukraine claims, but that are de facto under Russian control for the most part. And secondly, the offer to begin negotiations without, at this point, any preconditions. In other words, they're not saying, and you must do this and this and this. Let's sit down and negotiate what are clearly very different and positions that are far apart. But until the negotiations begin and people sit down and discuss them, you don't really know what compromises are possible. And I think it is a good sign that Russia is willing to discuss at a table behind closed doors, not in public, what compromises can actually be achieved. On the other hand, we have the difficulty that Ukraine has and that the West has in arguing that no negotiations are possible. No negotiations are possible. And I think that puts the West and Ukraine in a difficult position vis-a-vis the possibility of peace. It makes them look like they're not interested in peace because they're putting additional conditions. And especially, it makes it difficult for Ukraine to participate, in principle even, in a second peace conference. That is, in fact, how the first Swiss summit ended, with a call for future dialogue and negotiations among all parties. Everyone is, I guess, now expecting that to occur, but Ukraine, it's not clear if the West or Ukraine can participate in such a conference, given the limitations on how it approaches the possibility of negotiation.
We thought that Russia would talk about Odessa, Nikolaev. They didn't say anything about Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, these cities that are so important and are the access to the Black Sea for Ukraine. And it seems that they're open to negotiate on everything. Right. The problem is you don't see anything coming out of the West. Right after these preconditions coming out, Lloyd Austin said Putin has no right to do that. This is unbelievable.
I don't see this as an advantageous position for the West. It basically makes the West look very clearly like the ones wanting to prevent negotiations, because they have not peace in mind and not an end to the bloodshed, but, as they're very clear about, victory. The objective of the West vis-a-vis Russia in Ukraine is victory. And then the question really becomes not a diplomatic one, but a military one. Is anything that the West can offer to Ukraine capable of reaching or attaining such a victory, military victory over Russia? And I, along with, I think, most military analysts in the West, believe the answer to that question is no, no. Ukraine is simply at such a substantial disadvantage compared to Russia in its military forces, military capability, economic capability, that no amount of support that the West can offer can overcome that disadvantage in a war of attrition, in the kind of war that is being fought. Where does that leave us? Well, it leaves no option if the West continues to fight for victory, believes that the only objective that it can tolerate is a victory over Russia, then it must commit to putting in NATO troops in a direct fight against the Russian military, and ultimately to engage in a full-scale war with Russia. We have a real inconsistency, a real contradiction between the stated military strategy of the West and its diplomatic strategy, because it cannot achieve what it says is its diplomatic outcome, which is victory, without a much more aggressive military strategy toward Russia, which it says it doesn't want. So the West is in a bind. It needs to decide whether it's going to pursue a military victory against Russia or a diplomatic resolution of the conflict, because those are mutually exclusive, I think.
Yeah. And how about you talk about military victory? We know that Turkey recently said that if NATO wants to fight Russia, they're not going to be part of any sort of operations against Russia. We know that how important Turkey is within NATO. Is the most powerful ground forces are from Turkey, not even the United States, as Colonel Wilkerson pointed out on this talk show. And yeah, the other point, if we think that the West is trying to weaken Russia, any sort of weakening, militarily or their economy, it doesn't show anything coming out of this conflict in favor of the West. We know just World Bank recently reported they have been predicting that Russia would have an economic growth equal to 1.3. Right now they're talking about 2.9. It's much more, more than double than what there have been expected before. And we know that in the military, as you mentioned, these experts are talking about that Russia is outproducing in the war of attrition, which is the artillery is king of the battle. They are right now outproducing the whole West. You know, when it comes to these two aspects that are so crucial for this conflict in Ukraine, it doesn't seem that the West is winning in any of those fields. But at the same time, you see total disconnection between the policy and what's going on in the battlefield in Ukraine.
Which is why we have the current prolongation of the war without any end in sight. And the reason there is no end in sight is because the military means that the politicians are willing to consider do not match the political objectives that the politicians say they want. And that cannot be resolved. Again, as I said, you have to decide, are you going to pursue a strategic victory, as Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said, over Russia, or are you going to pursue a negotiated settlement, which it could possibly be interpreted by different sides as partial victory, not a victory for only one side. But the dilemma that we have is that in Europe and the United States, why do we not have any progress despite the obvious inconsistency? The reason is elections. We don't actually know what political forces will be in charge in Europe, Western Europe, and the United States 6 months from now. And as a result, we are in a limbo where no initiatives can be taken by the West because it undermines the authority and credibility of the political candidates as they go into election, as they go into making their case for their past policies. The past policies, I think many would say, have led to this failure, to this error in relations with Russia that have led to such terrible outcomes internationally and regionally in terms of security and economic prosperity for the world. But no one is going to change those policies before an election, because to do so, you would have to say, well, I made a mistake. Now I know what I'm doing. I've changed my mind. Trust me and vote for me again. Of course, the voters are going to say, well, what am I voting for? Am I voting for when you were all gung-ho for war, or am I voting for a peaceful resolution of the conflict now? I don't know anymore. So we are stuck with this paralysis. The aid that was offered by the United States and Europe over the course of this year and in previous years is not going to make any difference to the outcome for this year, because it is too little too late. By the time the funding is dispersed, by the time it reaches the source, by the time it is transferred locally into the various outlets that it needs to be spent in, a half a year or more will pass before the impact of this is felt. So the objective of this aid was simply to allow Ukraine to survive until the November US elections, to survive. But the problem is that the situation on the ground is more fluid, that Russia is on the offensive, and it is not clear how far this offensive will get before November. and this adds a great uncertainty to the process of negotiation, which in any case, from the West's perspective, can only be resumed politically, again, at the end of the year after the American elections in November.
Yeah. In your opinion, how much of these political changes that are happening in Europe, considering the new elections, are related to what's going on and what has been going on in Ukraine?
I think the impact of the war in Ukraine is indirect. In other words, it's not that people are saying, oh, I've changed my mind, we should not support Ukraine, or I think now, as opposed to 2 years ago, maybe Russia was justified. I don't think that that's happened. Most people still think that in Europe that the Russian invasion was illegal, and Russia deserves punishment for its actions. But what they are being impacted now is the lifestyle. Their living conditions have worsened. They are having to pay more for services and energy, and the cost of goods is going up. And there's a general sense among European voters that there is no strategy in Europe that can get us beyond this conflict and that can restore peaceful relations and security on the European continent. And that's what they're voting against. They would like to see, in that sense, a dramatic change in orientation. Even though they don't necessarily like Russia now, or anything like that, they want the policies to change so that they have a more predictable future in terms of their own security and their family's security in the countries that they live in, and in Europe generally. In other words, in some ways, they'd like to turn the clock back if they could. They probably can't. And I don't think the opposition, the countries that are in opposition to the political forces that are in opposition to the war, have enough force, have enough popularity to radically change the policies of their respective countries or of the EU generally. And we don't know exactly who the newly elected leaders of the EU and EU foreign policy are going to be, but the names being floated are, if anything, more bellicose even than and the head of NATO are more bellicose even than their predecessors. So what we may be seeing is another source of tension in Europe between a military elite and a bureaucratic elite in Brussels and NATO, which is more and more supportive of a hardline stance toward Russia and a commitment to fighting Russia for decades, if necessary, for decades, until the Putin regime falls and maybe even Russia's dismembered. You hear a lot of talk about that being pursued as an unofficial goal by some EU politicians. And on the other hand, their voters, the voters in those countries who actually would like peace and some sort of accommodation so that this conflict is resolved. And that discrepancy is what has led to the rather dramatic rise of the far left and the far right. But it would take even more to displace the center.
Yeah, but in your opinion, what's going on in Germany with considering AfD, Alternative to
Yes.
Germany, and the right wing in France? Do you see them as the same thing that we've been witnessing in Italy with Meloni, or the same thing that if they would be in the same kind of in the same category, it seems that nothing gonna change in the future considering these policies?
As a political scientist, I would say that the most popular social political science theories, the most popular political science theories, argue that when marginal groups are able to join coalitions and come to power that way, in order to broaden their base, they abandon their extreme positions and move toward the center. That is historically the case. But the problem we have in the case of Europe, I would say, is a little different from historical precedent, in that the center itself is seen as taking very aggressive and destabilizing positions, positions that undermine the safety and well-being of Europe itself. In that context, it might be more attractive for groups not to adapt them for marginal groups or extreme groups, not to adapt themselves to the center, but to try to force the center to take individual politicians away from the center and move them toward a broader coalition around the right or the left, which would then redefine itself as a peace coalition, a coalition for peace and prosperity in Europe, meaning an anti-war coalition. The really curious thing that today in Europe is that the total absence of a popularly based and politically supported anti-war movement. That historically in Germany, for example, has been the Greens, but the Greens are now totally pro-war, and that's very strange.
But when it comes to the policy in Ukraine, in the recent G7 summit, they were talking about just sending this $50 billion of the Russian assets in the hand of Europeans together with the United States to Ukraine. Do you think
Right.
that would be, at the end of the day, that would be possible, or they would do that, considering all these countries in Europe who are not agreeing with this type of policies?
What you're asking is, how important is power politics compared to compared to international law? Which is more important? I think the answer is obvious. It is power politics. And what that means is, whatever the law says, the countries that are able to abuse that law, to manipulate that law to achieve the political objectives that they want, will simply do so. And they will thereby redefine international law. They will say, well, we are the law, and what we say is actually the law. And the consequences of this are, I'm sorry to say this, exactly what Vladimir Putin predicted in 2007 in his famous speech at the Munich Security Council. He says, if international law can be twisted any which way to the advantage of individual states, then it becomes meaningless, and the entire global legal infrastructure and financial infrastructure collapses. So the willingness of Western countries, certain Western countries, and the United States, to simply seize the sovereign assets of any other country spells the demise of the current international order from which the United States benefits the most. People, countries, I keep saying people when I mean countries, countries that have invested in the US dollar as a reserve currency only do so because they trust that their assets are secure. And if they suspect that they are not secure, then they will withdraw them. And we're beginning to see this take place at significant levels now. Now, the main problem, I'm not sure if we've spoken about this before. It sounds familiar. May have been something we talked about before. But the main problem is there is no immediate alternative to the current system. But it's being worked on. And in his speech, the one we've referenced at the to the foreign ministry, Putin said, we just very specifically stated we are working on this to accomplish this as soon as possible. And I think it will be done. And as soon as that's in place, we will begin to see, I think, the reluctant transition from the dollar to an uncertain international financial system into something that promises to be more reliable, more honest, and convenient, maybe even at some point, to countries than the current Bretton Woods system, which the United States created and which the United States primarily benefits from. And it's a real paradox why the political leaders of the United States do this, which is essentially shooting itself in the foot. Although I do have a preliminary answer to that question. It's not a very generous one, but I don't think American, in particular, politicians understand economics. They just don't understand global economics because they live in a system in which laws can be imposed by authorities to condition economic outcomes. And we have a fiat currency, which the Federal Reserve System arbitrarily, or at its own discretion, essentially, can set interest rates and influence the economy. This system cannot be translated globally. I mean, we have the Federal Reserve and the American economy has a great influence internationally, but the sovereignty of other nations can, in fact, stop that influence. It can level it entirely, and it can expel countries and their political instruments and their economic instruments as well. And why do I say that American politicians don't understand this? I look at the example of sanctions. I believe literally that American politicians and the president believed that the imposition of sanctions, even from the first round of sanctions, would lead to the collapse of the Russian economy. And the fact that there have now been 11 subsequent expansions of sanctions without that result is not affecting their thinking at all. they cannot accept the evidence of their eyes because it contradicts their fundamental beliefs about the omnipotence of American dollars and American power. So this is not a rational discussion anymore. It is one that is built around a sense of faith and mythology about what the United States stands for. And it's only worse because we are getting into the heart of the election season where nobody talks about anything specific anymore. It's all about visions and how I'm going to make America great again, or it's never been as great as it is now, or greatness is my middle name. You know, everything has to be great, regardless of what you see before you. And that discrepancy is becoming evident to people, very much so. Again, I'll give you another example of this disconnect that you've highlighted. Everybody can see that the president of the United States is deteriorating physically and is probably on the verge of senility. Everybody can see that. Yet we have major American television programs, personalities, and networks who say, no, the opposite is true. The opposite is true. And people look at this and they say, this doesn't make any sense, and they turn it off. They say, you're just lying to me now. And they go to alternatives in social media, which are no better, because they're used to saying, well, the major networks will tell me the truth, or this is a vetted source, or I've listened, these journalists have been talking to me for years, and I've trusted them. And now the fact that they're lying to me about what I can see with my own eyes means that there's no alternative, because social media is a horrible place to get information. And most people at that point, they would have to find independent sources, multiple independent sources, and nobody wants to do that. Everybody's got their own. I mean, I can do that. You can do that because this is our profession, if you will, to know actually what's going on. But 90%, 95% of people just say, well, this is much too complicated for me, and they're all liars, and I don't want to get involved in this.
Yeah. When it comes to the negotiations and the way the West reacted to the Putin's preconditions, it's so amazing to see. They're talking about those strategies behind the scene. They're doing this, they're doing that. But it seems that it's so simple. I don't know if you just correct me if I'm mistaken. Right now, it doesn't seem that Zelensky wants this conflict comes to an end because his position is at risk. He's continuing in his position under the martial law. And in European Union, they're trying to distract their own people with the conflict in Ukraine in order to stay in power. Right now in the United States, Biden is trying to continue this war for the sake of 2024 presidential election. It seems that everybody's position is in favor of the continuation of this conflict. That's why we don't see any sign coming out of the West in order to have some sort of political settlement.
I think that's right, but I would add one or two additional things. I think awareness of the conflict in Ukraine is much greater in Europe generally because it's closer. And I think many of the initiatives, the Swiss summit, NATO itself, NATO headquarters, NATO statements, they all are important in a European political context. Here in the United States, the vast majority of people don't care about Ukraine. It's not an issue on our daily news or even our weekly news, to the extent that people watch the nightly news. It almost never comes up, or it comes up in a very short report. So it is for Americans a problem that is very far away and that we have dealt with by sending money. Now leave us alone. You got what you asked for. You asked for money. You got weapons. You can buy the weapons you want with the money that we're giving you. What more do you want from us? I think is and you do see some of that discussion in the opposition to the extension of funds. But sadly, most Americans don't understand how deeply in debt the United States is and what the consequences of this debt is, and that adds to the general perception that Ukraine is a problem, but not for the U.S. It's a problem for the Europeans, and we're going to help the situation, but it's not our problem. And Biden understands that. That's why his first words in all of his support are, "We will not send troops. Don't worry, we are not sending American troops into Ukraine. We'll send everything else, et cetera, and support democracy, et cetera. We're not sending American troops," because that's the only thing Americans will hear, is that they want to hear that we're not sending American boys to die in this country, far, far away. So I think that's the basic problem that exists in this relationship. The second aspect that I want to highlight is that when in the United States arguments are made in favor of supporting Ukraine by politicians, they are entirely mercenary. In other words, they say, we're not sending money to Ukraine. We're sending money that will go to American factories that will produce weapons, and not just for Ukraine, for everybody. And as a result, we are building up the American economy, and we are strengthening America's defenses, and it's America, America, America. And Ukraine is not the point for these initiatives. It is any conflict would do, which can be used to bolster and increase significantly the American military spending, which involves so much of the economy and involves so much distribution of arms and bases around the world. I mean, it's a huge endeavor that is indeed significant and important to the American economy. Now, NATO, the NATO standards are essentially American standards. So, and that is purposefully done because America needs to be able to sell its advanced weaponry to NATO. So the increase in NATO military spending, again, helps the American arms industry. And that's a very big reason why there is so little interest in a peaceful resolution of this conflict on this side of the Atlantic in the United States. Not only is it because, the cause of Ukraine is right and democracy must be supported and the rule of law must be supported, but we are also benefiting economically from the sale of weapons, and with Europe's withdrawal from a much more profitable partnership on energy from Russia, who are they winding up buying much of or some portion of their energy from? Again, from the United States at a much higher rate. And that, again, helps us economically. The big economic losers of this, and this is one of the reasons that there is a rift in the political perceptions, especially in the opposition in Europe, is that we're the ones getting disadvantaged economically as a result of this war. And the United States has said it is not going to provide the kind of support, these kind of subsidies to European economies, because that would never work here, that you couldn't sell that to American voters. And as a result, the economic consequences of this conflict, which is hurting European economies, will be borne, in fact, increasingly over time by European voters. And they don't all think that's a good idea.
Yeah. There is an article recently in the Financial Times that says Russia overtook the United States in supplying gas to the European Union in May,
For
despite
1 month.
Despite all of these difficulties that they're having in providing Europe with the gas, with energy. But here comes the question, the deepest question would be, can the United States separate Europe from Russia in terms of their energy, the things that Russia are supplying to the European Union? Is it a viable choice for the United States, or even let's consider that for the European Union?
Well, this energy relationship was important to the European economies, and the decision of the EU and individual states to sever that relationship has come at a great cost to the welfare of their citizens. The answer to your question, can this be a total cutoff? No, that's impossible. No country is totally cut off from the rest of the world. Not even, I mean, people imagine that this is true of North Korea, but it's not. They imagine that it's true of Iran, but it's not. And the problem is not sanctions or the inadequacy of sanctions. The problem is the nature of economics, the nature of humanity, of trade. Trade and economic relations are as natural as breathing and wanting to seek shelter. It's like water. It will always find a way through any obstacle. And you see this time and time again. And what we are literally seeing, and this is always the case with sanctions, and always will be the case with sanctions, is that sanctions always try to catch up to the innovation of humanity trying to outwit or get around these sanctions. And because the sanctions regime itself, any sanctions regime, has to go through legal hoops and be written up and must be implementable at X, Y, and Z, whereas people just flexibly, as commercial entities or traders, or all sorts of find ways around them repeatedly, and then the whole legal structure has to get re-engaged to catch up with that, and they're always behind. They always will be behind, which is why it's a self-destructive path. That it is the literal opposite of what used to be the liberal idea, which is that through trade, we establish the kind of not only relations, but dependency upon each other that will make war impossible. Now, of course, we are undermining these mutual dependencies, which leaves us with war as a logical option then. Although, again, the ultimate purpose of this war is not exactly clear. because it wouldn't lead to what everybody wants in principle, which is a peaceful world with free trade and free travel. So we in the West are moving away from our own liberal ideals in the name of, I guess, there's still ideals for the long term, but we just can't honor them right now, which is, again, I can only think of as the definition of insanity.
Yeah.
Doing something that is directly contradictory to your own long-term interests and expecting that by going in the opposite direction, you'll reach, that goal. It just cannot happen. So the logical alternative and the philosophically, politically, morally correct alternative is to pursue peace. Peace is not an easy objective, but at least if you say that is our goal, then having stated that goal, then the question becomes, how does one achieve it? And then you start by negotiating. Point 1, point 2, point 3. No, that doesn't work for me. I'll go, I'll do half of point 1, but I can't go any further. Okay, let's go to point 2. This is what I'm willing to consider. Anyway, it's a simple negotiation. What human beings have been doing for more than 5,000 years. There's nothing new under the sun. And again, all we have to do is decide that politicians have to decide this is what they want to do. In a democracy, countries that claim to be democracy should have an easier time listening to their people who I think clearly expect such an approach. To the extent that they are able to deny such an approach and reject it and pursue some other policy that is not advantageous to their people, I think it does call into question the degree to which our Western countries, our Western civilization can claim to be democratic.
I think, as you mentioned, peace is the most difficult thing to have right now, but is the safest and the most beneficial thing that we have so far. And
right, and I understand that there would be objections. They're saying, well, what do you mean by peace? We can't have peace at the barrel of a gun. We can't have peace if it's not going to last, and things like that. All of these matters have always existed throughout human history, all of these objections, and the way that you resolve them is the same as they've been resolved throughout history, which is through direct negotiations.
Yeah.
There is, in fact, no way to get everything that I want or the other side wants, but except through killing the other side, through eliminating them entirely. Then you're left all by yourself and can do whatever you want, presumably. But in a world in which there is more than one state, you always have to compromise. And the nature of that compromise is what the people most involved in the conflict have to decide for themselves. There's just no other way around that. And everybody who comes from the outside and says, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that, we can't support that, has ulterior motives that we need to understand. We need to understand, well, why would you object to a negotiated settlement of the two people in conflict? What is your interest in the conflict, in having this conflict continue? I mean, those are all important questions to answer along the way to achieving a sustainable peace.
yeah, just to wrap up this session, we know that Turkey, beside having this decision, they wanted to be part of BRICS. They don't want to pick a fight with Russia. And we know at the same time they want to be an energy hub to provide European with energy that comes from Russia and goes to Europe. And the decision here would be on the part of Europeans. Would they prefer to have the Russian gas from a third country or from directly from Russia? Because if they goes through Turkey or India, even India, it's unbelievable. It would be, they can easily manipulate these prices. That would not benefit Europe in the long term. And how do you see, do you think, does it have anything, any importance in today's European policy?
That is precisely how Russia's income for gas and natural resources has been increasing these past 3 years through these intermediary parties that either get around the existing sanctions or have been allowed by Europe and the United States and other countries to get around sanctions. In other words, they've simply turned a blind eye to what they know is happening. And again, I don't think there is any way to totally isolate any economy ever. You can therefore, if that is true of, and has always been true, if you look at the sanctions literature, of much smaller economies than Russia's, then you understand a priori that the task is an impossible one. And elected officials should be asked why they are then pursuing what they should know from a basic study of economics is an impossible task. And why are they putting their voters through this financial aggravation when no political benefit can be achieved from it? It's an unfortunate situation, but the only way out is to vote the people who are pursuing these illogical policies and policies that are damaging to their own citizens out of office. However, this is very, very difficult, at least in, certainly, I think, and not likely in this round of elections, because I think the situation will need to get worse in the West. And people will need to be subjected to greater insecurities, deprivations, and tensions before they will realize and think about what the sources of those tensions are and begin to think of look for alternatives to them. The alternatives are out there, but they are not receiving wide attention because, well, for obvious reasons. The mainstream media outlets are not interested in promoting these alternative narratives. They receive their support and their funding from the powers that are currently in control. And the solution among a more common solution in the West has been to control the narrative and to suppress dissident voices, hopefully allowing for a continuation of current policies, which does benefit certain groups and elites in the West, in Ukraine, and probably in Russia as well. There are always people who make money on warfare. It's always been a lucrative business. All the manufacturing and weaponry that goes into warfare, and whole new generations of weapons that are generated as a result of the lessons learned in warfare for the next generation. But I don't think that's very much in the interests of the average person. And so if the common man is going to have an impact on politics, they will have to start looking for alternatives to the people that they have elected in the past, and think about ways to curtail, actually, the military-industrial complex, which I can speak for the United States. No elected official that I can think of would be comfortable today, no national elected official stands against an expansion and support for the American military-industrial complex. We've gotten very, very far from Eisenhower's warning about the danger in his farewell address about the dangers of a military-industrial complex to American democracy. I think Samuel P. Huntington, the famous Harvard professor, put it very well. He said, at this point, the United States, it's not that the United States has a military-industrial complex. The United States is a military-industrial complex.